Frost Lake, in the northern reaches of Minnesota, looked like a postcard of winter. The surface stretched wide, frozen under layers of thick ice, glistening white against the pale blue sky. Locals bundled in coats and scarves moved cautiously on its banks, casting wary glances across the frozen expanse. No matter how beautiful the lake appeared, it carried a shadow. For 4 years, whispers about the place had lingered in diners, gas stations, and school hallways. It wasn't just a lake anymore, it was the place where the Carter twins vanished without a trace. Stories like this stick to a town, and once they do, they become part of its identity. Frost Lake was no exception. That's why today we're revisiting this chilling case. Before diving deeper, make sure to subscribe to this channel. By doing so, you'll never miss another story where truth hides beneath layers of silence and time. At the center of this case stood Sheriff Daniel Morgan. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed being in the spotlight. In his mid-40s, with tired eyes and a reputation for stubborn persistence, Morgan had carried this case in his chest like a stone since the day it began. To outsiders, he was a reliable officer. To his neighbors, he was a man who had failed to bring 2 children home. The weight of that failure haunted every glance he cast at the lake. The story began 4 winters ago. Emma and Ethan Carter, 12-year-old twins with bright laughter and boundless energy, vanished while camping with their parents. The Carters weren't strangers in town. Jack Carter was a mechanic who fixed trucks at the only repair shop along Highway 2, and Laura Carter taught Sunday school. They were known, trusted, loved. Their children were familiar faces at the local diner, ordering pancakes bigger than their heads. That made the disappearance all the more unbearable, because if the Carters could lose their children, it could happen to anyone. The memory of that week never left Morgan. He had walked the frozen shoreline until his boots were soaked, followed trails into the woods until his breath stung in the cold, and heard the twins' names echo in every shouted search call. Yet as days turned to weeks, the search yielded nothing but heartbreak. Emma's red scarf caught near the frozen edge of the lake had been the only clue. 4 years later, the town had learned to live with unanswered questions, though unease never truly faded. Morgan often sat in his patrol truck along the gravel road leading to Frost Lake, headlights dimmed, staring at the icy surface. He wondered if the water kept secrets buried, if answers lay frozen beneath layers no one dared to cut open. Every time he left, he told himself he would not return again, but something always drew him back. The Carters, too, bore their pain differently. Laura refused to give up hope, plastering missing flyers on community boards long after others had forgotten. Jack retreated into silence, working late hours in the garage, avoiding conversations that might force him to reopen wounds. Their marriage strained under the invisible weight, but both carried the same hollow absence where their children's laughter once filled their lives. For Sheriff Morgan, the case was more than professional duty. It became personal, not because of blood ties, but because of responsibility. The disappearance of Emma and Ethan was the one case he couldn't close, and in a small town that kind of failure never goes unnoticed. Each winter, when the lake froze over again, whispers reminded him, "That's where the twins vanished. That's where Morgan failed." And then one morning, in the thick of January, a phone call pierced the silence of his office. Ice fishers, cutting through Frost Lake's thick crust, had spotted something beneath the frozen surface, not just the dark shimmer of weeds or fish, something human, something that made their hands tremble as they dialed 911. For Morgan, the words from dispatch froze him in place. After 4 years of silence, the lake had finally spoken. Whether it would deliver truth or more pain, he couldn't yet know, but deep inside he understood. The story wasn't over. The lake still had something left to reveal. The day had started like any other winter outing in Minnesota. Jack and Laura Carter wanted to give their children a weekend away from the noise of daily life. Frost Lake, despite its reputation for biting winds and dangerous ice patches, was a place they had visited before. That Saturday, the sun shone faintly through a veil of clouds, casting pale light over the frozen water. The air was sharp, each breath visible as mist. Emma and Ethan, bundled in matching navy coats, chased each other across the snowy clearing near their family's tent, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. Laura stood by the campfire, holding a mug of hot cocoa, her eyes following their movements. "Don't go too close to the edge," she warned, her voice half playful, half serious. "We won't, Mom," Ethan shouted back, kicking snow in his sister's direction. Emma laughed and darted behind a tree, her red scarf trailing like a ribbon in the wind. Jack adjusted the logs on the fire, glancing at his wife. "They've got energy for days. Hard to believe they'll actually sleep tonight." Laura smiled, though a mother's unease flickered in her eyes. She brushed it away, reminding herself they were safe. Frost Lake was wide and cold, but they were together. As the afternoon slipped into evening, the temperature dropped. The twins had wandered a little farther into the trees, their voices faint. Jack called out, "Emma! Ethan! Dinner's almost ready. Come on back." No answer. Laura set down her mug, her heart skipping. She cupped her hands around her mouth. "Kids, let's go, it's getting dark." The silence that followed pressed against her ears. Only the wind rustled through branches. Jack frowned, pulling on his gloves. "They're probably playing hide-and-seek again," he muttered, though unease crept into his tone. He trudged toward the tree line, calling their names louder. Minutes passed. The fire crackled behind Laura as she scanned the woods, her chest tightening. "Jack!" Her voice wavered. "They're not answering," he said, emerging from the trees, his face pale. His eyes darted toward the frozen lake. "Laura, check the shoreline." Panic surged through her veins as they split in opposite directions. Her boots crunched on the snow, her breath shallow, frantic. She called again, louder, her voice trembling. "Emma, Ethan!" Nothing. Only the icy expanse stared back. By the time Jack returned, his expression told her everything. They hadn't just wandered too far. They were gone. Laura fell to her knees in the snow, clutching her chest. "No, this isn't happening. They were right here." "They were right here." Jack crouched beside her, his hand trembling as it touched her shoulder. "We need help, now." They raced back to their truck, the heater blasting as Jack's numb fingers dialed 911. His voice cracked as he explained, every word soaked with urgency. Within 30 minutes, the first patrol car arrived, its red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. Sheriff Daniel Morgan stepped out, his boots sinking into the snow. He listened carefully, eyes scanning the shoreline as Jack explained how quickly the twins had vanished. Laura clutched his arm desperately. "You'll find them, won't you? Please tell me you'll find them." Morgan held her gaze. He wanted to promise, but the weight of uncertainty already pressed heavy on his chest. "We'll do everything we can," he said firmly. Then, turning to his deputies, his voice hardened. "We need to cover the woods and the lakefront. Every second counts." The night grew colder, the forest darker, as flashlights cut beams across the snow. The Carters huddled by the fire, their faces lit with hope and fear, waiting for the sound of their children's voices to break the silence. But the silence lingered heavy and merciless. That night, the town of Frost Lake changed forever. The first night after the twins' disappearance was frantic. Dozens of townspeople responded to the sheriff's call, showing up with flashlights, dogs, and determination. Snow crunched under boots as neighbors, teachers, and friends spread out across the woods, shouting the twins' names into the bitter wind. The air was sharp, cutting through coats, yet no one complained. No one wanted to leave until the children were found. Sheriff Daniel Morgan coordinated the effort with urgency, his voice steady despite the weight pressing on him. "Sweep the tree line, stay in pairs, mark any tracks and keep your radios on." His breath fogged in front of him as he pointed searchlights toward the frozen expanse of Frost Lake. Deputies dragged the beams across the ice, searching for signs, anything. Laura Carter stood near the patrol cars, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, rocking slightly as if holding invisible children. Her voice cracked as she called out again and again, "Emma! Ethan!" Jack stood close, silent, his face hard and pale, refusing to show the panic twisting inside. He clenched his fists, muttering, "They couldn't have just vanished. Someone had to see something." The first obstacle emerged quickly, snow. Heavy flakes began falling around midnight, erasing footprints, swallowing faint signs of passage. What might have been clues disappeared beneath a fresh white blanket. "Damn it," one deputy muttered, brushing snow from his hat. "It's like the storm's working against us." By morning, rescue dogs were brought in, sniffing frantically along the shoreline. They circled one spot, where the red scarf had been found tangled in brittle reeds near the frozen edge. "Could be a marker," Morgan said quietly, crouching to examine it. The scarf's fabric was stiff, damp with melted frost. Laura gasped, recognizing it instantly. "That's Emma's, I tied it myself." She reached out with shaking hands but pulled back, unable to touch it. Hope flickered in the crowd, but dread followed close behind. If the scarf was near the water, did that mean the twins had slipped beneath the ice? Some searchers exchanged uneasy glances. Rumors began spreading quietly, whispers of drowning, of thin ice hidden under fresh snow. Others, unwilling to accept that, murmured about abduction. "There were strangers camping out here last week," one fisherman said, shaking his head. "Could have been one of them." The theories grew, feeding fear. Jack spun on the man angrily. "Don't you dare say someone took them unless you know for sure." His voice carried across the silent crowd before he stormed away, breathing heavily, grief and fury blending in his chest. Sheriff Morgan struggled to maintain focus. He barked orders, but inside he was battling doubt. The scarf had been the only tangible clue, and without tracks or signs of struggle, the case was like chasing shadows. He caught himself staring at the ice, imagining two small figures beneath, the thought tightening his throat until he forced himself to look away. Search parties continued for days. Helicopters hovered above, their rotors stirring snow into swirling clouds. Volunteers scanned from above, while boats broke through thin patches of ice, dragging hooks through freezing water. Nothing surfaced. Each day ended with exhaustion and bitter disappointment. Laura refused to leave the campsite. She kept the fire burning, waiting as if her children might step out of the woods at any moment. Jack stayed too, though his silence grew heavier, his eyes empty as he polished the same wrench over and over by the truck, his mind far from the metal in his hands. By the end of the second week, the crowd of volunteers thinned. Hope was a fragile thing, and for many, it had already shattered. Sheriff Morgan stood by the lake one evening, the red scarf folded carefully in his pocket, staring at the frozen water that gave nothing back. His jaw clenched as he whispered to himself, "Not like this. I won't let it end like this." Yet despite his vow, the lake stayed silent. The wind carried only echoes, and the names of Emma and Ethan faded into the cold air unanswered. Winter eventually loosened its grip, but the search never delivered the miracle everyone prayed for. By spring, the woods had thawed, the lake's ice had melted, and still nothing surfaced. The Carter twins remained missing, their absence heavy in every corner of town. Flyers faded on telephone poles, their edges curling under rain. At first, fresh copies replaced them, but over time fewer were printed. Faces grew used to the sight of Emma and Ethan's photographs until they became part of the background like old posters for long-past concerts. The Carters carried their grief differently. Laura refused to stop fighting. She kept boxes of flyers in the garage, driving to nearby towns on weekends to post them on boards at gas stations and grocery stores. When neighbors told her gently to rest, she snapped back, "Resting doesn't bring my children home." Nights found her scrolling online forums dedicated to missing kids, exchanging messages with strangers who promised tips that rarely led anywhere. Jack, in contrast, turned inward. He worked longer hours at the auto shop, often falling asleep in his chair with grease still on his hands. Conversations at home dwindled to short exchanges. "Dinner's ready," or "I'm heading out." He couldn't bear to look at the empty bedrooms, the twin beds neatly made but never disturbed. One evening, Laura confronted him. "You don't even say their names anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jack stared at the floor, his jaw tight. "Because saying their names doesn't bring them back." The silence that followed widened the gap between them. Meanwhile, Sheriff Morgan felt the slow erosion of his reputation. In the first months, the town rallied behind him, praising the long nights he spent on the case. But as years dragged on with no resolution, whispers grew sharper. At the diner counter, patrons leaned over coffee cups and muttered, "Maybe Morgan missed something, maybe he wasn't up to the job." Even friends he'd known since childhood avoided his eyes, offering stiff nods instead of warm greetings. At town meetings, frustration boiled over. "How do two children vanish into thin air?" one man shouted, slamming his fist on a folding table. "We deserve answers." Morgan stood at the front, his uniform crisp, but his spirit worn thin. "We followed every lead, searched every inch of Frost Lake and the surrounding woods. There's no stone left unturned," he insisted. But the anger in the room told him his words no longer carried the same weight. Businesses around Frost Lake felt the change too. Once a quiet spot for summer campers and winter anglers, the lake became a place people avoided. "Bad memories stick to places," the owner of the bait shop muttered, locking his door earlier each evening. Cabins sat empty and tourism withered. The lake, once a source of livelihood, had become a scar on the town. For Morgan, the hardest part was the drive past Frost Lake. He often slowed his cruiser along the gravel road, headlights sweeping over the water at night. The lake, frozen again each winter, seemed to mock him with its stillness. He rolled down his window, listening to the wind whistle through the pines, half expecting to hear laughter or a cry for help long overdue. Instead, there was nothing but silence. Inside, guilt gnawed at him. He replayed every decision, every trail he followed, every lead he dismissed, wondering if he had missed the one clue that could have changed everything. Sometimes in the stillness of his office, he caught himself whispering, "Where are you?" as if the twins could answer across time. By the 4th year, the Carter case had been officially labeled inactive, a polite word for forgotten. But for Laura, Jack, and Morgan, forgetting was impossible. Their wounds remained open, and every winter's first snowfall reopened them wider. The town moved on, but those most affected stayed trapped in the day of the disappearance, frozen like the lake itself. And yet, even in silence, Frost Lake waited. It was the heart of January, a season when Frost Lake lay locked under a thick crust of ice. The sky stretched grey and low, carrying a stillness that seemed eternal. On most weekends, men bundled in flannel and heavy boots dragged sleds across the frozen surface, hauling drills, buckets, and bait. Ice fishing wasn't just a pastime. It was tradition, passed from fathers to sons. That morning, 3 friends from town, Rick Dawson, Marty Ellis, and Carl Jensen, set up their small circle of holes on the eastern side of the lake. They laughed and cursed the cold, their voices echoing faintly across the frozen expanse. Rick pushed the auger into the ice, turning with steady rhythm until water splashed up through the hole. He leaned down, peering at the dark water below, when something caught his eye. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, just weeds swaying under the ice. But the shape didn't move like weeds. It looked too still, too defined. "Carl," he said slowly, his breath misting in the air, "come look at this." Carl shuffled over, kneeling beside the hole. He squinted, his brow furrowing. That's not a log, is it?" His voice carried unease. Marty leaned over as well, his fishing rod forgotten in his hands. "Jesus, that looks like fabric." He reached instinctively toward the water, then pulled back quickly as a chill ran down his spine. The 3 men stared silently, hearts pounding. Beneath the ice, pale shapes clung to stillness, frozen in time. A flash of color, dull now but unmistakable, floated near the surface of the shape. Fabric. Blue, faded but distinct. Rick's hands shook as he reached for his phone. I'm calling the sheriff," he muttered, his voice breaking. When the dispatcher answered, Rick's words tumbled out in uneven bursts. "We were fishing. Frost Lake, under the ice. There's something down there. Someone, maybe kids." Back at the station, Sheriff Daniel Morgan froze when the call came through. The words hit him like a blow. Bodies under the ice. For a moment, the office felt too small, the air too heavy. He gripped the edge of his desk, trying to steady his breathing. The Carter case had never left his mind, but hearing those words reopened every wound. "Deputy," he said sharply, grabbing his coat, "get the divers on standby." "We're heading to Frost Lake," His voice was steady, but inside dread churned. He knew what this might mean. He also knew that if it confirmed what everyone suspected, it could break the town all over again. When he arrived at the lake, the fishermen stood pale and shaken, their faces etched with fear. "We didn't touch anything," Marty insisted, his voice trembling. "We just saw it and it looked wrong." Morgan knelt by the hole, the icy wind cutting across his face. He forced himself to peer into the water, and there it was, the faint outline of something human, preserved by the frozen barrier. His throat tightened, and he turned quickly, standing tall. "Secure the area. No one gets close until the dive team arrives." Carl's voice cracked. "Sheriff, it's them, isn't it? The twins?" Morgan hesitated, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. "We don't know yet," he answered carefully, though his heart already whispered the truth. As deputies stretched tape around the fishing site, the news began to spread. Phones buzzed, whispers raced through town, and within an hour, small groups of residents gathered at the shoreline. Some crossed themselves, others shook their heads in disbelief. After years of silence, the lake had finally given something back. Morgan stood apart, watching the frozen expanse. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched in his gloves. After 4 years, the nightmare had returned to the surface, and this time there would be no ignoring it. The dive team arrived within the hour, their truck crunching across the snow-packed road, equipment rattling in the back. The air was bitter, so cold it seemed to steal breath with every inhale. Sheriff Morgan stood with his arms folded, watching as the men suited up. The fishermen who had made the discovery lingered near the edge of the taped-off area, faces pale, eyes darting between the sheriff and the lake. One of the divers, a broad-shouldered man named Harlan Briggs, pulled down his mask and spoke through chapped lips. "Sheriff, we'll take it slow. Ice is thick and visibility's poor under there. But if something's lodged, we'll bring it up." Morgan gave a curt nod. "Be careful, and whatever you find, handle it like evidence." The men lowered themselves into the freezing black water, flashlights cutting pale beams beneath the ice. The surface cracked with muffled groans, echoing across the silent crowd that had gathered by the shoreline. Every eye was fixed on the divers, breath fogging in tense anticipation. Minutes stretched like hours. Then a shout muffled through radio static. "We've got something!" The first diver surfaced, hauling up a waterlogged backpack. Its canvas was stiff, edges crusted with ice. Morgan stepped forward immediately, crouching to examine it. Faded initials were stitched in red thread across the front pocket. EC. For a moment his vision blurred. He had seen that backpack before. Emma Carter had carried it to school nearly every day, a little frayed from use, decorated with pins she collected. Behind him, Laura Carter's sharp cry tore through the air. She had rushed to the scene after hearing the news, and now collapsed against her husband, clutching his arm. "It's hers, Jack. It's Emma's," she sobbed, her voice raw. Jack said nothing, his jaw locked, eyes fixed on the lake, as if staring hard enough might turn back time. Minutes later, the divers resurfaced again, this time with something heavier. 2 skeletal remains, bound together by the weight of the water, emerged from the depths. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Deputies scrambled to cover the scene with tarps, but whispers had already begun. "It's them! The twins!" Morgan's heart pounded in his ears. He wanted to shield the parents from the sight, but it was too late. Laura's cries grew into wails, echoing painfully across the frozen lake. Jack's hand gripped her shoulder, steady but trembling, his face ashen. He whispered hoarsely, "We knew this day might come," though the words felt hollow in the bitter air. The remains were carried gently to waiting vehicles. Even through gloves, deputies handled them as though they might shatter. The crowd stood in reverent silence, hats pulled low, some crossing themselves, others murmuring prayers. In a small town, grief was communal, and this discovery cut deep into everyone present. As evidence was logged, Morgan's gaze fell back to the backpack resting on the snow. He picked it up carefully, his thumb brushing across the faded initials. Memories of Emma's bright smile and Ethan's mischievous grin flashed in his mind, faces frozen in time. His throat tightened. "We finally found you," he murmured under his breath. But the relief was short-lived. Dr. Karen Mills, the county medical examiner, crouched beside the remains, her trained eyes scanning details others might miss. She looked up at Morgan, her face grim. "These bones, they don't line up with drowning. There's trauma here. Fractures that don't match an accident." Morgan's stomach sank. He stared at her, his jaw tightening. "You're saying this wasn't the lake's doing?" She shook her head slowly. "I'm saying someone may have put them here." The sheriff turned back toward the crowd, where whispers of closure mixed with grief. For a moment, he wanted to let them keep believing the lake had swallowed the twins by accident. But deep down, he knew the truth was more dangerous than silence. The lake had spoken, but it hadn't told the whole story. The county morgue, usually a quiet place, became the center of an investigation that carried the weight of 4 years of unanswered grief. Sheriff Morgan walked down the sterile hallway, the echo of his boots steady but heavy. He carried with him the weight of the Carter family's sorrow and the responsibility of telling a town that their tragedy was more complicated than they imagined. Dr. Karen Mills met him in the examination room, her gloved hands poised over the remains laid carefully on stainless steel. She was a woman known for her precision and calm, never rushing her words. "Sheriff," she began, adjusting her glasses, "I've run preliminary assessments. You'll want to hear this." Morgan folded his arms, bracing himself. "Tell me straight." Karen pointed to the bones, her voice steady. "First, these fractures here, Ethan's radius and ulnar. They're clean breaks, but not consistent with drowning or natural accidents. They're peri-mortem, meaning they happened around the time of death. That doesn't happen from slipping on ice." Morgan's brow furrowed. "So someone hurt him," she nodded. "And Emma's remains show signs of blunt force trauma, skull fractures. It wasn't the lake that took them. Someone placed them there." The words hung in the air like frost. Morgan clenched his jaw, his chest tightening. "We've been telling people it might have been an accident. Now you're saying—" Karen met his gaze firmly. "I'm saying you need to treat this as homicide." Morgan paced the room, running a hand across his face. Images of Laura's sobs and Jack's hollow stare flooded his mind. They'd wanted closure, but this revelation would rip open wounds all over again. Yet he couldn't bury the truth. Not now. Back at the station, deputies gathered around as Morgan delivered the findings. The room grew tense. One deputy, young and restless, asked, "So we've had a killer walking around town this whole time?" Morgan's voice was firm. "We don't know yet who or why, but this wasn't an accident." From this moment on, the Carter case is a homicide investigation. Word traveled quickly, as it always did in a small town. By the next morning, whispers filled the diner booths and grocery aisles. "They didn't just drown," someone murmured over a cup of coffee. "Someone put them there." Fear crept back into Frost Lake, colder than the winter wind. Parents pulled their children closer. Old rumors resurfaced, talk of strangers, of drifters, of shadows seen near the woods the night the twins disappeared. Laura Carter, upon hearing the news, sat rigid at her kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she gripped the phone. "So someone hurt them?" she whispered to Morgan when he called. His silence lasted too long. Finally, he answered, "Yes. And I won't stop until I know who." Her sobs cracked through the line, raw and heartbreaking. Jack took the phone from her, his voice low but edged with anger. "You had 4 years, Sheriff. 4 years. And now we're supposed to believe you'll figure it out?" Morgan swallowed hard, forcing calm into his tone. "I failed before. I won't fail again." After the call, he sat alone in his office, staring at the case file that had haunted him for years. Pages yellowed from time, photographs of Emma and Ethan smiling innocently, the red scarf catalogued as evidence. All of it felt like ghosts pressing against him. The new truth didn't just reopen the case. It forced him to confront the possibility that someone he knew, someone who lived among them, had stolen the twins' lives. As the day ended, the sheriff stood at his window, watching snow drift lazily across the streetlights. The town was quiet, but under the silence fear pulsed like a heartbeat. The lake had given them bodies, but now it demanded answers. And Morgan knew he was about to reopen a wound deeper than the cold waters of Frost Lake. Sheriff Morgan knew he couldn't move forward without speaking again to the Carters. 4 years had changed them, carved lines of grief into their faces, and he braced himself before knocking on their door. The house was the same pale blue, though the yard was untended, patches of snow covering broken branches and forgotten toys half buried beneath ice. Laura opened the door. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but there was a spark of determination in them, the same spark that had carried her through years of handing out flyers and writing letters to organizations that rarely wrote back. She stepped aside silently, gesturing for him to enter. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Stacks of binders and folders lined the dining table, each neatly labeled: missing children cases, leads, media contacts. Laura sat down across from him, clutching a worn notebook. "I never stopped," she said firmly, her voice raw but steady. "Every night I searched for something, someone who might help. I kept telling myself, if I stop, they'll disappear forever." Morgan nodded slowly, guilt pressing against him. "Laura, I wish I'd found them sooner. I can't undo what's happened, but I can promise you this, now that we know, I won't let their case stay silent again." Her eyes filled with tears, though she held them back. "Do you know what it's like to walk into a grocery store and see people look away? To hear them whisper that maybe I should have watched them closer? That maybe it was my fault?" Her voice broke for a moment. "I carry that every day." Morgan leaned forward, his tone softening. "You're not to blame. Whoever did this made a choice. And it's my job to find them." In the background, Jack appeared in the doorway, his shoulders hunched, grease still smudged on his hands from the garage. He didn't greet Morgan, didn't even sit. He stood with arms crossed, eyes heavy with resentment. "So, you found their bones," Jack said flatly. "And now what? You drag up the pain we've been drowning in just to tell us it wasn't an accident?" Morgan kept his gaze steady. "It's not about dragging up pain, Jack. It's about finding the truth. Don't you want justice for them?" Jack's lips pressed into a thin line. Justice won't bring them back. Justice won't erase the nights Laura woke up screaming, or the silence in this house every morning. "You had 4 years, Sheriff. Why should I believe you now?" The words cut deep, but Morgan didn't flinch. He understood the anger, even welcomed it. "Because this time we have evidence, and I won't stop until I know who's responsible." Laura reached across the table, placing her hand on Jack's arm. "He's right," she whispered. "We owe it to Emma and Ethan." Jack looked away, his jaw tightening, but he didn't argue further. The conversation shifted, Laura flipping through her notebook. "I kept every tip that came in, no matter how small. Some people swore they saw kids who looked like Emma and Ethan in other states. Most of it was nothing, but maybe now with what you found something might connect." Morgan accepted the thick folder she handed him. "I'll go through it, every page." For the first time that day, Laura's expression softened. "I don't care how long it takes. Just don't let their story fade again." When Morgan stood to leave, Jack finally spoke, his voice quieter, but sharp with restrained pain. "If you fail us again, Sheriff, don't come back here." Morgan paused at the door, meeting his eyes. "I won't fail you, not this time." Stepping out into the cold, Morgan pulled his coat tighter. The Carters were broken, but their pain only steeled his resolve. Somewhere in this town someone carried the truth of what happened, and he would dig until it came to light. Sheriff Morgan spread the old files across his desk, pages yellowed at the edges, the ink fading but the weight of the case as sharp as ever. He combed through statements, patrol logs, and community tips that had been dismissed years earlier. This time, he read every line as if searching for a hidden code, and buried in those pages, he found names that hadn't been given enough attention. One stood out: Daniel Holt, a drifter arrested for trespassing in Frost Lake Woods just 2 weeks before the twins vanished. His record stretched across states: assault charges, disturbing conduct, and an accusation of child endangerment that had never gone to trial. At the time, Holt had been dismissed as irrelevant. But with what the forensics now revealed, Morgan couldn't shake the thought that Holt might have known more. He drove to speak with Carl Jensen, one of the longtime residents who'd spent nearly his whole life near Frost Lake. Carl was the kind of man who remembered details others forgot, his memory cataloguing years of hunting seasons, weather changes, and strange faces. Sitting across from him at his cluttered kitchen table, Morgan pulled out Holt's photo. "Do you remember this man?" he asked. Carl squinted, adjusting his glasses. "Yeah, he camped out here for a spell, kept to himself mostly, but I remember folks said he had a temper, always looked over his shoulder like someone was chasing him." Morgan leaned forward. "Did you ever see him near the Carter's campsite?" Carl's eyes narrowed as he thought. "Can't say for sure, but I do remember hearing a truck late at night, right around the time those kids went missing, headlights bouncing down the road. Thought it was odd. Don't know if it was him, but he did drive an old Ford." The detail made Morgan's pulse quicken. "And you never mentioned this before." Carl's voice hardened with guilt. "Sheriff, we were all saying a lot of things back then. Most of us thought the kids drowned. No one wanted to believe otherwise." Leaving Carl's house, Morgan sat in his truck, staring at the falling snow. A drifter with a violent past, a truck leaving late at night, and bones that told of foul play. The pieces were aligning, but not enough to convict. Back at the station, he shared the lead with Deputy Ross. The younger man frowned, flipping through the old file. "Problem is, Sheriff, Holt's been off the grid for years. Last arrest was in South Dakota. After that, nothing. If he's our guy, tracking him down won't be simple." Morgan rubbed his temples. "Simple was never part of this job. Get me everything you can on Holt. Friends, family, anyone who might know where he went." But Holt wasn't the only name stirring unease. Old police reports mentioned a different figure. Earl Simmons, a seasonal worker who had been staying at a nearby lodge the week of the disappearance. He'd been questioned briefly back then after a waitress reported he'd made the twins uncomfortable when they'd stopped by the diner with their parents. The waitress's note in the file was blunt. "Man stared too long." Kids looked uneasy, but nothing had tied him to the crime, so the lead had gone cold. Now, revisiting it, Morgan felt anger rising. How many threads had been overlooked? How many doors left unopened? He clenched his fists, whispering to himself, "Not again. I won't let it slip this time." The town, meanwhile, buzzed with speculation. At the gas station, voices lowered but carried sharp words. It was someone local, had to be. At the diner, others countered, "No, it was that drifter. He was bad news." Each rumor poured fuel on a fire that threatened to consume the fragile peace Frost Lake had rebuilt. As Morgan sat alone in his office that night, the files spread before him, he realized the truth was more tangled than ever. Too many suspects, too few certainties, and a town desperate for answers. Somewhere in those pages lay the key to Emma and Ethan's final hours. He just had to find it. Sheriff Morgan's office felt colder that evening, though the furnace had been running all day. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of the case pressing down on him like a vice. The truth was slipping just out of reach, and he could feel time running out. The case, once a tragic mystery, was now becoming something darker. Someone in this town had answers. He sat alone at his desk, flipping through the file on Daniel Holt. The man's criminal history seemed like a pattern: assault charges, accusations of violence, even a brief stint in a rehabilitation facility that never stuck. Yet there was nothing concrete that tied him to the deaths of Emma and Ethan. Morgan's mind wandered back to the night the twins had vanished. He could almost see them running near the lake, their carefree laughter echoing in his mind like a fading memory. Had Holt been watching them? Or was there someone else? He wasn't sure yet, but the pressure to uncover the truth felt unbearable. Deputy Ross entered with a stack of papers. He looked weary, his eyes scanning Morgan's face for a hint of direction. "Sheriff, I've got the last known address for Holt. It's in a small town near Fargo. He hasn't been in touch with family since '02, but I found a few names that might help." Morgan rubbed his temples, trying to steady his thoughts. "Get a team together. We're going after him." But before they could make any moves, the phone rang. Morgan's stomach tightened as he picked up. "Sheriff Morgan." The voice on the other end was familiar. Karen Mills, the medical examiner. Her tone was sharp, urgent. "Yeah, Karen, what's going on?" "I've got something you need to see," she said. "It's about the remains we recovered from the lake." Morgan's heart skipped. "What's wrong? What else is there?" There was a pause on the line, and then Karen spoke again, her voice heavy with the weight of her words. "The trauma on their bodies. It's not just from blunt force. There's something else. Something you're not going to like." Morgan's jaw clenched. "What do you mean?" Karen took a breath before continuing. "There are traces of something in their system. A sedative. Someone drugged them before they were killed. The air in the office seemed to freeze. Morgan's mind raced as the implications hit him. The twins had been drugged. They hadn't just been caught unaware, they had been incapacitated. That meant whoever had taken them had complete control over the situation. "Do you have the substance?" Morgan asked, his voice tight. "Yeah," Karen replied. "I'll send you the lab results as soon as I can. But Sheriff, you need to be ready. This changes everything." Morgan hung up the phone, his pulse pounding in his ears. He stood and paced the room, trying to process the new information. Drugged. They had been drugged. That meant whoever was responsible had planned it. A deep, cold fear settled in his chest. It wasn't a random act. Whoever took the Carter's children knew exactly what they were doing. Morgan ran his fingers through his hair, trying to control the rising frustration. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. The case had gone from tragic disappearance to premeditated murder, and the new revelations only added more questions. Ross was still standing in the doorway, waiting for instructions. "Sheriff, what's next?" Morgan exhaled sharply, regaining his focus. "We're not going to let this go. We've got new evidence. We need to follow up on Holt and Simmons, but we also need to start looking at everyone who was near that lake that night." Ross nodded. "I'll get on it." Morgan stood still for a moment, staring at the files spread across his desk. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture was still incomplete. Holt was a suspect, but was he the killer? And what about Earl Simmons? Had he been the one to drug the children? The sheriff knew one thing for certain. The deeper he dug, the more complicated the case became, and the more dangerous it was for everyone involved. He had a town to protect, but it was becoming clear that the darkness lurking in Frost Lake wasn't just in its depths, it was in the people who called this place home. With renewed determination, he grabbed his coat and headed out the door. The case was back in full swing, and this time he wouldn't let it slip through his fingers again. The morning after the call from Karen Mills, Sheriff Morgan stood at his desk, staring at the evidence laid out before him. New information, new suspects, and still the answers remained just out of reach. He had long ago learned that the truth often required more than just diligent police work. It required patience. But his patience was wearing thin. His eyes drifted over the file once more, landing on a name he had overlooked before. Stanley Hall, a retired fisherman who had been a fixture at the local bar before the twins disappeared. According to his statements from the original investigation, Hall hadn't been particularly useful. But one thing he had said stuck out to Morgan. "I saw a truck near the lake the night the kids went missing." But it wasn't anyone I knew. Morgan frowned. He had never followed up on Hall's statement. It had seemed too vague at the time, another half-remembered detail that didn't lead anywhere. But now, with so many pieces of the puzzle falling into place, it felt like something he couldn't afford to ignore. Picking up the phone, he called Deputy Ross. "I need you to go to Stanley Hall's place. See if he remembers anything more about that night. If he saw a truck, we need to know who owned it, and get his contact list. There might be someone he's forgotten about." Ross replied with a quick, "Got it, Sheriff," before hanging up. As Morgan waited for Ross to return, he sat back in his chair, running his fingers through the stubble on his chin. Something about the mention of the truck unsettled him. It felt too familiar, like a detail that had been buried beneath the surface of the case for too long. An hour passed before Ross came back, holding a few fresh notes and shaking his head. "Stanley's a bit of a recluse these days, says he hasn't been out much since he stopped fishing, but he remembered the truck. Didn't think much of it at the time, thought it belonged to some tourists. He didn't catch a license plate, but he said the truck was dark, maybe black, and it left in a hurry." Morgan stood up, frustration building. What else? Ross hesitated, glancing down at his notes. He mentioned one more thing, something that stood out after we left the scene. Hall says he remembered hearing a loud noise, like something heavy hitting the ice. He didn't think it was much, just thought it was someone messing around. But it happened right after the kids disappeared. Morgan's mind raced. A loud noise. Could it have been the twins, the sound of their struggle, or someone throwing something into the water? The possibilities gnawed at him. He had no way of knowing for sure, but it was enough to keep him digging. He looked at Ross. Get me everything on that truck. Pull the records of any vehicles registered near Frost Lake around that time and check with the locals. Someone had to have seen something. We're missing something big here. Ross nodded, already heading for the door. I'll get on it. As Ross left, Morgan sat in the quiet of his office, staring at the new lead in front of him. A truck, a noise, Hall's half-formed memory. It wasn't much, but it was the most promising lead he had in days. His thoughts were interrupted when the phone rang again. Morgan jumped, grabbing the receiver with a tight grip. "Morgan," he answered, his voice clipped. "This is Karen Mills again, Sheriff," came the calm voice of the medical examiner. "I have the final results for the twins. I think you need to come here. There's something else you should know about their injuries." Morgan's stomach clenched. "What now, Karen?" "Just come," she said, her tone insistent. "It's important." He slammed the phone down and grabbed his jacket, his pulse quickening. The pieces were shifting, but the more he uncovered, the more tangled it became. The truck, the noise, and now the medical examiner with something new to reveal. Morgan stepped out into the cold, his breath visible in the sharp morning air. Frost Lake was as still as ever, but in his gut he could feel the storm that was coming. He had a sinking feeling that everything he had uncovered so far was just a glimpse into something far darker. When he arrived at the morgue, Karen met him with a somber look. She led him down the sterile hall to the examination room, where the twins' remains lay under a sheet. Karen didn't waste time. "Sheriff, I've gone over their injuries again. It's not just blunt force trauma like I first thought. The fractures in their skulls, well, they were made by something specific, something heavy, a hammer, or something like it." Morgan's breath hitched, but he steadied himself. "A hammer?" Karen nodded grimly. "It's consistent with the type of damage found in the skull. This was deliberate. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." His heart sank as the gravity of her words hit him. The twins hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had been hunted. The information Karen Mills had revealed shook Sheriff Morgan to his core. A hammer. That was the weapon that had killed Emma and Ethan, or at least what had caused the fatal trauma. It was deliberate, personal. Nothing about the deaths had been random or accidental. It all pointed to someone who had made a choice to end their lives, someone who had planned it out with terrifying precision. Morgan stood at the edge of the morgue, his hands clenched into fists, trying to piece together everything he had learned. This wasn't just a case of missing children anymore. It had evolved into something darker, something more sinister. He couldn't shake the images of the twins' bodies in the morgue, the trauma they'd endured, the agony they must have felt. For a moment, he wondered how he'd ever be able to face the Carters again. He could see their faces, Jack's broken silence and Laura's raw grief. They'd trusted him. They'd trusted that he would find answers, and yet, for years, he'd failed them. But now, with a new lead in hand, Morgan knew he couldn't back down. He drove to the station, his mind racing with every turn. As he entered his office, Deputy Ross was already there, sorting through a stack of papers. "Sheriff," Ross said, looking up from the desk, "I've got a lead on that truck Stanley Hall mentioned, the one he saw near the lake. I tracked down a local who remembers seeing a black Ford F-150 parked just a few miles from the Carters' campsite the night the kids disappeared." Morgan's pulse quickened. Who saw it? A guy named Tom Granger, works at the gas station on Route 3. He said he remembered the truck because it was parked in an unusual spot, right off the main road under the trees. Said it was out of place, so he made a note of it. Morgan exhaled sharply. "Get Granger's full statement. We need to track that truck down. I want to know who owns it, where it's been, and if it's still in the area. Every detail." Ross nodded, already reaching for the phone. Morgan paced the room, his thoughts still circling back to the hammer. He kept visualizing the scene, Emma and Ethan trapped, helpless. Who could do such a thing, and why? The answers seemed further away than ever, but he was determined to find them. An hour later, Ross returned, holding a folder with more details. "I've got the name of the owner. It's a man named Earl Simmons, a seasonal worker who used to stay at the lodge near the lake. He's been in and out of the area for years, but the truck's registered in his name." Morgan froze. Earl Simmons. The name rang a bell. He'd been questioned during the initial investigation, but had never been linked to the crime. However, now with the new evidence, things had changed. Simmons had a history, nothing major but enough to raise suspicions. Morgan recalled the waitress from the diner who had reported that Simmons made the twins feel uncomfortable. He had a reputation for being a loner, someone who didn't interact much with others. Morgan looked at Ross. "Get me everything you can on Simmons. His whereabouts, background, anything that ties him to the lake or the Carters." As Ross got to work, Morgan stepped out of his office and walked to the back of the station where his car was parked. The cold air bit at his skin as he started the engine, his thoughts swirling like the snowflakes falling around him. Earl Simmons. Could he be the killer? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture was still unclear. Simmons could have been the one to drug the twins, to take them under the cover of night and force them into whatever happened next. The hammer. It was all starting to make sense. But there was still one more question left to answer. Why the Carters? Why Emma and Ethan? As he drove toward Simmons' last known address, Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something monumental. It wasn't just about catching a killer anymore. It was about understanding the twisted mind behind the crime. Who was Earl Simmons, really, and what was his connection to the Carters? He parked outside a small, weather-beaten house at the edge of town. The door was slightly ajar, and the place looked empty. No lights, no movement. Morgan felt the familiar weight of dread settle in his chest. This was it. He was close. "Earl Simmons," he muttered under his breath as he approached the door. "Let's see if we can finally get some answers." Sheriff Morgan stood at the door of Earl Simmons's weathered house, the cold biting at his face as he knocked. His heart was pounding, not from fear but from the weight of everything that had led him here. The truck, the hammer, the lies from the past, it all circled back to Simmons. He knocked again, louder this time, but no one answered. The wind howled around him, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and pine. The small house, tucked away at the edge of town, looked abandoned, yet Morgan knew better. Something about this place didn't sit right. He pushed the door open slowly, its creaking sound breaking the silence that had settled over the area. Inside, the house was dark, the air stale. The clutter of old furniture and boxes suggested someone had been living here recently, though it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a hiding place. "Earl Simmons," Morgan called, his voice firm, echoing through the small space. No answer. Morgan stepped in, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. His instincts told him to be cautious, but there was no time for hesitation now. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He called out again, but still there was no reply. As he moved deeper into the house, a cold chill crept up his spine. The air felt thick, as if it was holding its breath. Then, at the far end of the room, Morgan noticed something strange. A heavy metal tool chest sat against the wall, its lid slightly ajar. He approached it cautiously, his hand hovering near his gun. His mind raced. Was this where it had happened? Was this where the hammer had come from? As Morgan lifted the lid, a sharp metallic scent filled the air. Inside there was an assortment of tools, but one stood out among the rest, a hammer, blood-stained and covered in rust. His stomach turned. It was the same type of hammer he had seen in the medical examiner's report, the one that had left the fatal wounds on Emma and Ethan. Morgan's pulse quickened as he pulled the hammer from the chest, inspecting it closely. It was unmistakable. This was the weapon that had been used. Before he could process the discovery, he heard a shuffle behind him. He turned sharply, drawing his weapon, but there was no one there, only the sound of footsteps slowly coming closer. "Who's there?" Morgan demanded. From the shadows of the doorway, Earl Simmons finally stepped into view. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but there was something cold and calculating about his expression. He didn't flinch as Morgan aimed the gun at him. Simmons' voice was low, gravelly. "I was wondering when you'd find your way here." Morgan's heart raced, but his tone remained steady. "Where are they, Earl?" Simmons didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the hammer in Morgan's hand, a slight smirk creeping across his face. "You're too late," he said. "You'll never understand why I did it." Morgan's grip tightened on his gun, but he didn't pull the trigger. Not yet. "Why, Earl? Why Emma and Ethan?" Simmons took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Morgan's. "They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. I didn't want to hurt them, but things had got out of hand." His voice faltered for the briefest moment, but then he straightened, regaining his composure. "They had to pay for what their father did." Morgan's confusion deepened. "What do you mean? What did Jack Carter do to you?" Simmons' lips curled into a bitter smile. "Jack Carter ruined my life. He doesn't even know what he's done to me, but he'll never get away with it. Not after everything." Morgan's mind raced, piecing together the implications of Simmons' words. Jack Carter. What had he done to provoke this kind of rage? It didn't make sense. The sheriff's voice was sharp now. "You're saying you killed those kids because of something Jack did?" Simmons' gaze flickered with a strange mix of satisfaction and resentment. "That's right. And now you're here, asking questions you'll never get answers to. You should have stayed away." Morgan tightened his grip on the hammer, his body tensing. "This ends now, Simmons." "It's over." For a moment there was silence between them, thick with tension. Simmons's cold smile never wavered. Then suddenly his expression shifted. He lunged at Morgan, but the sheriff was faster, slamming him to the ground with a force that knocked the breath from Simmons' lungs. "I'm taking you in," Morgan snarled, pinning him down as he called for backup. Simmons struggled beneath him, but it was clear the fight was over. He had no more power here. Morgan had the answers now, and the truth was finally within reach. As the sound of sirens grew louder outside, Morgan stood up, his breath heavy in his chest. The case wasn't over, but it was a step closer to the resolution the Carters and the town deserved. Earl Simmons's arrest was just the beginning of unraveling the twisted web that had been buried for years. Sheriff Morgan stood outside Simmons's house, his breath fogging in the cold air. The immediate danger was over, but the deeper questions remained. What had really driven Simmons to murder the Carter children? And more troubling, what role had Jack Carter unknowingly played in all of this? Morgan glanced at the patrol cars pulling up, the flashing lights illuminating the trees surrounding the small house. Deputies began to move in, securing the perimeter. But as Morgan's eyes stayed fixed on Simmons, now sitting in the back of a squad car, the truth seemed more elusive than ever. Ross approached, his face grim. "Sheriff, we've got Simmons in custody, but he's not talking much. He keeps mumbling about Jack Carter, about how the twins were the price for a debt that was never paid." Morgan's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they didn't fit together yet. "Keep on him. We need a confession. Whatever it takes." As Ross moved away, Morgan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Simmons wasn't the only one who held the answers. He needed to know what had happened between Simmons and Jack Carter, the incident that had sparked this madness. Driving back to the Carters' home, Morgan felt the weight of what he was about to do. Jack and Laura had been through hell, and now they were going to have to face the truth no matter how painful it was. When he arrived, he found Jack working in the garage, his back to the door as he wiped his hands with a rag. He didn't look up when Morgan entered, and for a moment Morgan hesitated. But this wasn't the time for hesitation. "Jack!" Morgan called out, his voice steady but laced with regret. Jack turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "You found him, didn't you?" he asked, his voice flat. "How found Earl Simmons?" Morgan nodded. "Yes, we did. But there's something else, Jack." Jack's eyes narrowed, and he set the rag down. "What are you saying?" "There's more to it than just Simmons, Jack," Morgan said quietly. He claims you owe him something, that he did what he did to your children because of a debt." Jack's face went pale, his eyes flickering with confusion. "A debt?" he repeated. "I don't know what the hell he's talking about." Morgan stepped closer. "You need to think, Jack. There's something you're missing, something that could help us understand why Simmons chose your family." Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. "I swear to God I don't know what he's talking about. I never owed him anything." "I don't even know the guy that well." Morgan studied Jack's face carefully. There was no sign of deception, just confusion and raw pain. He wanted to believe Jack, but the circumstances made it difficult. "Think, Jack," Morgan urged again. "Is there anything at all about Simmons or a debt that you might have forgotten? It could be the key to ending this." Jack looked down, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of a workbench. He took a long breath, then met Morgan's gaze. "There is one thing. But it's nothing like what you think." Morgan's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Jack hesitated, his voice low as he spoke. "A few years ago I got involved in a business deal. I was struggling to keep the shop afloat. I made a bad choice and borrowed money from some unsavory people. One of them was Simmons. I didn't know him personally, but he was connected to the people I borrowed from. I didn't realize what kind of guy he was until later. After I paid the money back, I thought it was over." Morgan's eyes widened as the pieces began to click together. "You didn't tell anyone about this?" Jack shook his head. "No, I didn't want Laura to worry. It was done, or so I thought. I didn't know he'd still be holding a grudge." Morgan's mind raced. The debt. Simmons had never let it go. It was all starting to make sense. He had manipulated the situation, taking everything from the Carters, not for money, but for revenge. "Jack, you're going to have to come with me," Morgan said, his voice heavy. "We need to confront Simmons. He needs to answer for what he did. But we need your help to understand how far this goes." Jack nodded, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I never thought it would come to this. I should have told Laura." "I should have—" "Don't blame yourself," Morgan interrupted, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this. Together." As the two of them left the garage and got into Morgan's truck, the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The truth was out there, but it was buried under layers of deception and pain. And the closer he got, the more dangerous the answers would become. The sun was setting when Sheriff Morgan and Jack Carter arrived back at the station, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. The town of Frost Lake felt quieter than ever, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. Inside the station, the air was thick with tension. Morgan's thoughts raced, but now, with Jack's confession and the pieces falling into place, it was time to face the truth. He motioned for Jack to sit at one of the desks, his face hardening as he began to go over the plan. "We're not done yet," Morgan said, rubbing his hands together. "We need to go back to Simmons. He's not just going to admit what he did. We need a confession, and we need to connect all the dots before it's too late." Jack nodded, the weight of the situation settling deeper into his bones. His face was still pale, haunted by the consequences of his past decisions. "I never thought I'd be sitting here talking about something like this," Jack said quietly. "I never wanted my kids to pay for my mistakes." Morgan met his eyes, his voice softer than it had been before. "You didn't know, Jack. You couldn't have known what he would do, but now we have the chance to put an end to this, to make sure he never hurts anyone again." The words felt hollow, but they were all they had left. There was no undoing the damage, no way to bring back the lives that had been stolen. But there was still a chance to give the Carters and the town some measure of closure. As they entered the interrogation room, Morgan saw Earl Simmons sitting there, his hands cuffed to the table. His eyes flickered up at them, the same cold smile playing at the corners of his lips. He didn't look afraid. He looked smug. "I was wondering when you'd come back," Simmons muttered, his voice low and casual. "Didn't take you long to connect the dots." Morgan didn't respond immediately. He simply walked over and placed the hammer on the table in front of Simmons, the weapon that had taken 2 innocent lives, the object of so much pain and suffering. Simmons' eyes narrowed, and his smirk faltered for a moment. "You don't know what it's like, Sheriff," he said, his voice quieter now. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything, to have your life destroyed and then watch everyone go on like nothing happened. Jack's a damn fool. He never understood how much he owed me." Morgan leaned forward, his voice steady and controlled. "What happened, Simmons? Why did you do it? Why take two innocent kids?" Simmons' expression shifted, but only slightly. "It wasn't about them," he muttered, his gaze dropping to the table. "It was about Jack. He didn't keep his promises. He broke his word, and I couldn't let that go." Jack stood behind Morgan, his hands clenched at his sides, fighting to keep his composure. "I paid you back, Simmons. I paid you everything I owed. Why couldn't you let it go?" Simmons finally looked up, his eyes dark with resentment. "You don't get it, do you? It wasn't about the money. It was about control. I wanted him to feel the way I felt, helpless. And when I saw his kids so innocent, so full of life, I knew what I had to do. I didn't want to kill them. But you don't understand what it's like when you're pushed to the edge. You'll do anything to get even." Morgan stayed quiet, letting Simmons's words settle in the air. It was all coming out now, everything that had been buried beneath years of anger and resentment. The truth was raw, but it was clear. Simmons had never been interested in redemption. He was only after revenge. "We'll make sure you never hurt anyone again," Morgan said firmly, standing up. "But you're not getting away with this." As Simmons was escorted out of the room, Jack stood still, staring after him. The storm of emotions within him was overwhelming. Guilt, anger, relief. He'd been living with the weight of this for too long. But now, it was finally over. Morgan placed a hand on his shoulder. "Okay, it's done. You can start healing now." Jack didn't say anything at first. He just nodded, his voice a rasp. "Thank you, Sheriff, for everything." Outside, the town of Frost Lake remained quiet. It always did after a storm passed. But for the Carters, the weight of the past would never fully leave them. The pain would linger. But there was a chance for a new beginning. As Morgan looked at the empty streets, he knew one thing for sure. The truth had finally come to light. The shadows that had hung over the town were gone. But the scars would remain. And sometimes, that was all anyone could ask for.